Good morning. The question has arisen about healing work. And of course, one of the most important functions of our work is the healing work, for the simple reason that the amount and the degree of the healing work testifies to the degree of our spiritual awareness. Healing work in our work in the infinite way is a little different than in the old days of mental healing. It was a much simpler matter to bring about healings 30 or 40 years ago than it is today, because the healing work then was entirely on a mental basis. There was very little, almost no spiritual healing. There was some little among those who had a measure, a degree of spiritual consciousness. For instance, Mrs. Eddy says that she herself did not use mental argument for healing. That meant, of course, she was doing spiritual healing. On the other hand, we have manuscripts of hers in her own handwriting in her earliest days showing that her healing then was entirely mental. There was nothing spiritual about it. She knew nothing of God or Christ in those days except an orthodox sense of God. But there are manuscripts, I have copies of some in her own handwriting, in which she says that when she healed, she usually took on the disease of the patient and had to have someone pull her out of it. Now that's purely a mental process of healing. But she went from there to a little better sense of mental healing, I mean for her students, probably for herself, and that was in the days when you treated by you are well and you know it. You are God's perfect child. You are spiritual. Evil cannot come nigh your dwelling place. And the treatment was addressed to you, to the patient. And you just sat there and let that mental pressure pour in on you, and ultimately you believed it. You'll find evidences of that in miscellaneous writings under Mental Treatment Illustrated, in which the practitioner keeps up this line of argument until the patient's mind yields. And then the patient says, I am well and I know it. Of course, that is healing by suggestion. That is just the power of one mind over another. And Mrs. Eddy warns that in this type of treatment you must be careful. Why? Because from the same mind that can do good, or rather the same mind that can do good, can do evil. And that was her discovery in the days of the first edition. She found that some of her practitioners who were doing healing work with their minds were also doing malpracticing. That is how a great deal of the scandal about Mrs. Eddy and Christian Science came about, not due to any fault of hers, but due to the fact that at that time she didn't know the same mind that could do good could do evil, and she had prepared no protection against it. And so there were men, practitioners in her group, who not only were whispering in their patients' ears that you are well and you know it, but they were also whispering in their ears, bring me more money when you come next time. And a few things more serious than that. And in the first edition of Science and Health, she warns against that type of mental practitioner. And she was referring only to her own students because they were the only mental practitioners of those days. And she had to throw out several of her early practitioners because of their mental malpractice. Now, the reason that mental healing was easier in those days than this is for the same reason that in the first year in which penicillin was given, there wasn't as much given in an entire year as later was given to one patient in one shot. In other words, as time has gone on, people have built a resistance to penicillin, and so with each inoculation, it must be stronger. And so it has been with mental treatment. In the early days, people knew little or nothing about the mind. All they knew about was the body. Their mind had not been subjected to propaganda, to advertising, as we know advertising today. And so the mind was a fertile field to work on, and it responded. You will find also that Mrs. Eddy says that the day will come when it will not be necessary for a thief to enter your house to steal. He will just sit in his home and give you a mental treatment, and you will bring to him what he wants. Now that was the result of her experience with mental malpractice. It was true in those days, but it is not true now. The human mind has built such a wall of defense against that it is a very difficult thing to sway it by treatments. As time went on, and that was recognized, a man in the Christian Science movement became known as one of the greatest healers in the movement. Cases that other practitioners couldn't touch, he could heal. And he became very famous in the country as a healer, and people asked him his secret. And for a long, long time he wouldn't give it because he wanted to be a loyal Christian Scientist. Finally, when the demand grew very strong, people, even practitioners, insisted they must know this man's secret. He was doing such wonderful work. He wrote a book about it, and he tried to have it published or authorized from Boston and failed. And so he left the movement. And when he left, thousands of people left with him. Hundreds in a single church left with him. And then began another era of better healing works. It only lasted for a few years. Now, his system, that was William W. Walters, his system was that a practitioner should not take more cases than they could heal, preferably not more than 3 or 4 in any week. And he said, of course, a practitioner can't afford to live off of a practice on the ordinary Christian Science rate. Therefore, you must only take those cases where the patient can pay you enough to give your full time to it, and then you must give that patient 5 treatments a day if necessary, 8, 10, 15 treatments. So if you only have 3 or 4 or 5 patients, you could really spend your 8 or 10 hours giving each one 3, 4, 5, 6 treatments. And again, it would be until the patient's mind yielded. Now, in his writings, Mr. Walters makes clear that this is purely a mental science, but that there is a higher one, a spiritual science, but that he felt the world was not yet ready for it. Certainly the Christian Science field, he felt, wasn't ready for it. And up until very late in his experience, he refused to talk much about that spiritual science or spiritual healing. I believe in his first or second, probably both books, in the last chapters, there is something on the subject of spiritual healing, and then he promised a group that next year or the year after he would take some of the more experienced practitioners and reveal to them the truth about this spiritual science, this spiritual healing. And then he passed on before that happened, and he never did, nor did he ever write a book on spiritual healing. But he made it clear that his success was based not on Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, but on the first edition of Science and Health, and that its basis was this mental treatment, this continued repetition of the truth that I am God, you are God, and so forth and so on. And as I say, it worked beautifully for some years, and his movement, called the Walter Movement of Christian Science, spread rapidly in the United States and in Europe. It was a very large movement at one time. There was a period when he was teaching classes of 5,000 students at one time. And then it gradually petered out for the same reason that the New Thought movement has petered out, that these mental treatments after a while do not work. It becomes an impossibility to keep, as a practitioner, to keep mentalizing, to keep up this heavy routine of directing thoughts at a patient and finally controlling their minds to the point where they would say, oh, I am well and I know it. Evidently, Mrs. Eddy herself rose above that because she says that I myself do not use mental argument for healing. Well, of course, if you're not using mental argument for healing, you are in the realm of pure spiritual healing, where you are just being quiet and letting the Spirit flow through and do its work. However, without a knowledge of the letter of truth, that soon would deteriorate into a faith healing. The idea would come even into that practitioner's mind, well, the Spirit is certainly healing disease through me. And in time, they would lose that power, because that would be healing through a belief, not through truth. The belief that there is a greater power doing something to the lesser power called disease. It is for this reason that even when you get into the realm of spiritual healing, you cannot become what is called an absolute student, or a student of the absolute. There are plenty of students of the absolute, very few of them willing to conduct their healing practice, very few willing to go out and really do practitioner work. It is so much easier to sit back and say God is love or God is all, and nobody needs healing, and ignore the world. But to do spiritual healing, it is necessary that the practitioner never lose sight of the fact that God is not a power that is to be used over these other powers called disease. I remember my Christian Science teacher telling me that he went through class, metaphysical college class, with Albert Gilmore, and they had a teacher conducting this metaphysical college class, and after, as you know, these classes are only 6 days, but at the end of the third days, my teacher and Mr. Gilmore talked it over and said, I wonder why we're here. We're certainly not getting anything. This man doesn't seem to know as much as we do. Mr. Gilmore said, I've been thinking that same thing. I just don't understand what we're doing here, or why he's teaching this, or why he was selected to teach this college. He certainly doesn't know much about Christian Science. Well, on the fourth day, this man came to the class, and he said, I have decided to share with you a letter that I received from Mrs. Eddy some years ago. And he said, I always carry it in my pocket and occasionally refer to it. And he read a letter from Mrs. Eddy to him saying that practitioners in their work must always realize that God is not a great power to be used over lesser powers, but that the practitioner should realize there are no lesser powers. And then my teacher and Mr. Gilmore decided that they knew why this man had been selected to teach that college. It was necessary that they hear that letter. And that letter became the basis of my teacher's practice throughout his days as a practitioner and teacher. That was the basis from which he personally worked. So much so that when I went through the class, he never gave 5 minutes to the subject of treatment. Never once did he tell us how a treatment should be given or what should be contained in a treatment. He just wanted to keep away from that subject so that the students would catch the idea that a treatment was not meant to control someone's mind or to destroy some evil powers. At another time, in an association, a student asked the question, how would you protect your treatment after you gave it? And he said, I had never thought of that, but it's a good question. And it comes to me that if I had given a very good treatment and wanted to protect it, I would say, now, I thank you, Father, that this treatment isn't going to heal anybody. But certainly, if that treatment were going to heal anybody, it would have to accept the fact not only of someone to heal, but something to be healed, which again sets up that power apart from God. Now probably you thought that last night I had introduced a new note or a new teaching into the infinite way in saying that God is not power. And that isn't true. You find that in the infinite way, not stated in those words, but the essence of it goes all through. As a matter of fact, all the infinite way is, the book, The Infinite Way, is nothing but the unfoldment of God as infinite being. Understanding God as infinite being, there would be no other being. And so when the infinite way speaks of God as power, and it does, it always speaks of God as infinite power and that there is no other power. Now when you read it in the light of that, God as power is understood in a different way. In other words, instead of the statement God is not power, we could just as well say God is power, only not power as the word power is usually understood. In other words, God is not a power that goes out and does something to other powers. But whatever God is, it is certain that it maintains 2 times 2 is 4. It maintains the integrity of the tides and day following night, the appearance of sun, moon, stars. It certainly maintains the integrity of its universe. I cannot remember at this moment whether it was Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle, but I'm sure that it's one of those three, who made or wrote the statement that you can know God's love by its law. You can know God's love by His law or its law. Now, we could again say God is love, or we could say God is not love. If we say, and I mean without contradiction, because if we say God is love, we would mean not that God is love as human beings understand love, but in some other sense that is far removed from the human sense of love. We could illustrate that this way and bring to the idea of God's love being shown forth in His law. Just in the fact of mathematics and music, you have laws. Now, God does not punish us for the violation of those laws, yet we are punished for their violation, and necessarily so. Why? If you are practicing music or mathematics, there's only one way that you can have any certainty, any surety of what you're doing, and that is that the numbers, their values, the notes and their values forever remain the same without exception. Now, if ever there could be an exception, let us say in mathematics, you might say, oh, it would be so loving if 2 times 2 would only be 5 today. Oh, God, if you could only do that for me today, that might be a human sense of love. But God has no such sense of love. There is no such love in the mind, heart, soul, or activity of God as changing a law even to save your life. You must conform to the law, and in that would be shown forth God's love. In that sense, we could say God is love. You look at the chart of the tides, and you see they have them charted 1,000 years ahead. In that, then, would be God's love, in that you can know, the navigator can know, the fisherman can know 1,000 years ahead. Not that he needs it for 1,000 years ahead, but for as long as he needs it, he knows the tides, the hours, the depths. He knows, and he knows also it will never be set aside. And that constitutes God's love to him, that as long as he abides by that law, he is in safety. The man who violates that knowledge, that law, is in trouble. So God's law would not extend to protecting the man in violation of a law, but it extends to the point of maintaining that law for the benefit of those who come into harmony, into the awareness of its being. Then God's power might be said to be the maintaining of its own integrity, the maintaining of its own values, qualities, equations, and not in a power such as we think of in the healing of disease or in the regulating of other affairs of our lives. It isn't a power to which we can turn to get something done. It is a power maintaining the integrity of the universe to which we can conform. So in saying God is not power, the meaning of it is that God is not power in the accepted sense of the term, as being something to which you could turn to get it to do something for you. In your garden, God is a power. But try to get God to make an exception in your garden, and then you would see that in that sense, God is not power. Now, in the same sense, people are ill, and they're good people very often, and they're in tremendous pain, and you look to God. God, why is this happening? How can this happen? Can't you do something about it? All the time really expecting God to step out of character, to do something special in a certain case where actually there has been a violation of the law and God itself cannot step in to intervene. It becomes necessary that ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Not that there is a truth circulating around in consciousness that can come to you to dispel your troubles while you are in violation of the law. But you say, supposing we don't know that law. That's sad. That is our task on this path, to learn what that law is and how to come into conformity with it, how to live in accord with it. We have signposts on the way. There are reasons why in our work we have some wonderful, wonderful successes in healing work and why we have some very horrible failures. I haven't yet met the practitioner of any degree of integrity who hasn't had wonderful success in healing work, nor have I met one, regardless of their integrity, who hasn't had some miserable failures. And the answer always is the same. Why is that true? Why does what I know work so beautifully in one case and the same disease or the same condition in another, it doesn't work? Well, we have certain guides to our living. When we live in opposition to those revealed laws or graces, we bring ourselves under the laws of discord and inharmony, and even God itself does not seem able to remove us from them any more than a navigator navigating against the laws of the sea can bring his ship into port regardless of his probably purity of character or prayers to God. There must be a conformity to these laws. Now, there are times, of course, when a person is in ignorance of the law and continues to suffer in that ignorance, and nothing can be done about it until the light comes. There are other times when there is a continued willful violation of law, and from the experience, not only mine, but many other practitioners, there seems no way of releasing people until they give up the violation of the law. Now, let us illustrate here. We, of course, are assuming that you accept the message and the mission of the Master as a guide. You know that prayer is the means of God contact. Prayer is the means of healing. And you're told under prayer, well, you're told in one place that if you go to the altar to pray and there remember that any man has aught against you, to get up and make your peace with your brother and then return to the altar. Well, there very often is a violation, and I've seen that the overcoming of that violation, the turning from it, has done some miraculous things. We sit around nursing our grievances, personal, national, international, holding someone in condemnation. Doesn't make no difference whether it's an individual, a racial group, a religious group, a color group, or a national group. We sit holding someone in condemnation and expect to go to the altar and have our prayers heard and answered. In other words, we expect the divine harmony of God while we sit around in discord, in violation of the law. Whereas, if we were obedient to that instruction, we would get up, we would stop our prayers, and we would sit down and say, what is this sense? What is this thing that I am holding? Hate, condemnation, judgment, criticism, injustice, intolerance. What is all this that I'm permitting to escape through me? And then you would understand, aha, I get it. I am having two worlds, a spiritual one and a material one. I am holding people in bondage to material sense while inwardly declaring the spiritual nature of being. That would not in any wise prevent us from commenting or noting the irregularities of human existence, but even though we noted them, saw them, witnessed them, there would be no right within us to condemn or hold in personal criticism or condemnation as individual being without the realization of the fact that this was an impersonal thing operating in human consciousness, not as law, not that we should hate, not that we should punish, but rather that we should see through and understand. In the same wise, someone personally injuring us, there would be no need, and the law wouldn't call for us to be personally on terms of intimacy or friendship or household visiting with them. It would merely mean a lack within us of personal condemnation. In other words, the opposite sense of, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. I can imagine the Master saying that of Judas and of Peter, but I can't imagine him sitting down the next day and spending a day at meals or games or instruction with Judas or Peter, not until they had learned their lesson and brought themselves back into the fold through an adherence to the spiritual law of love. In the same wise, we have, and you will note this very, very frequently in your work, we have a spiritual law. To him that hath shall be given. From him that hath not shall be taken even the little that he hath. Now you who have practiced, think back on some of your patients who have come to the office, or those who have written you, and whose entire period with you is taken up with a rehearsal of their human lacks, limitations, and have-nots, and how very few minutes they permit you to sit with them and give them or draw forth from them the truth of being. I had an experience of that kind recently, in which a lady wrote me a 4-page letter, and then a 6-page letter, and then an 8-page letter. And every single one of those was filled from top to bottom with human error, and always an apology at the bottom for taking up so much of a busy man's time. Now, personally, I don't mind my time being taken up, and I wrote that to her. But I said, I am sure that you could have filled those same pages with what you know of spiritual truth. Then you would have given me a foothold in your consciousness. You would have given truth a foothold. Now, I said, let us see if you can begin with this Bible reference, to him that hath shall be given, and sit yourself down each day with plenty of paper and pen or pencil, and forget all human situations while you're at your desk, and begin to write what you know of truth. Well, it may be that at that given moment you can only remember one truth. It may be a Bible truth, it may be a metaphysical truth, but that's all you can remember. Your mind's a blank on the subject of truth anyhow. And but write that one down, and then sit there and wait, and just wait for a second one to come along. I'm sure if you wait long enough, you will find that out of the depths of your withinness, a second statement of truth will come. Now, I would set aside as many periods a day as possible for going back to that paper and write a book on truth. It may never get published, but it'll be the beginning of one that may ultimately get published. Write a book. Write every statement of truth you can remember and what you know about that statement of truth, and hold yourself within that bound. Now then, we also violate that law of to him that hath shall be given. You watch the miracle in your life as you sit down and let the human experiences for the moment be outside the range of your thought while you sit and contemplate some truth. Makes no difference if you begin with quotations. Very soon you will find that you will pass beyond the realm of quotation into your interpretation of the quotation. And from that beginning will come a pouring forth of an infinity of truth within or from within your own being. To the one statement of truth that you know will be added many, many, many truths pouring forth from consciousness, and all of them healing waters. In the very early experience of practice in Boston, a school teacher came to me who had witnessed some healings there and felt that she wanted to know more about what was bringing those healings forth. And she would come to me every Saturday for some instruction. And one day I realized this isn't right. This isn't right. What am I teaching her? What am I supposed to be teaching her? What am I teaching her? Each time she comes, we just hit or miss on some subject, and we talk about it for an hour, and I can't see that that's teaching. I can't see that she's gaining much. Something more than this is involved in teaching. Then the thought came to me, well, do you know what you're teaching? Do you know what the principle is itself? Well, that's a good question. Do I know? Am I certain of this as a principle, as a science? And so I sat down and thought, well, there is a starting point. What is the basic principle? And I wrote down a Bible quotation, and I liked it. I thought, that's right. That's our starting point. Now, where would you go from here? So I put down another Bible quotation, and before I left my desk, I had 7 Bible quotations down there that seemed to make a perfect pattern of what I was trying to teach. At least it gave me something that I knew would be good to teach, would be correct, and would be effective if one accepted it. But when I came back to my desk the next day, looked at those quotations, I thought, that doesn't seem to be enough. More than that, what? And all of a sudden, that first one began to go around my thoughts, and I began writing. And lo and behold, I had my own ideas of what that first Bible quotation meant. And before I left my office that day, all 7 of those Bible quotations had been carried out to a greater extent than the quotations themselves, and that was the basis of my teaching that school teacher. She thought it was a wonderful thing. It was so systematic and all based on a principle. Well, you know, after a while, those points were embodied in letters that circulated for years and years and years, and then became the pamphlet, The Real Teacher and the 7 Steps. Those 7 steps had their beginning from the time when I knew a lot of unrelated truths, but all of a sudden I caught the relationship between one point and another, wrote them down, and then carried them forth further. And even to this day, without any advertising, without any recommendations, that pamphlet outsells all of the other small pamphlets. I don't understand it, but evidently those points and the way they're covered gives something to a student. Now, those who have had practice with patients in other cities or states also must realize that every time you write a letter of truth to a patient, you are not only giving them something in the way of a principle, but you are clarifying it for yourself. And very often that's more important than what happens to the patient. Just as the 7 steps have been more important to me and thousands of patients than they ever could have been to the one who brought them forth originally. Now, watch this. Every time that you take some statement of truth that you know and sit down and write a few hundred words about that, you know more about the statement than when you began. Therefore, it is clear that you are opening your consciousness to a deeper unfoldment and a deeper consciousness of truth by that very fact. Now, that is the need for each one of us. Incidentally, I can look back now, I didn't know it then looking forward, But I can look back now and see that the infinite way could not have evolved in any other way. It began with letter writing, and it kept on with those 7 points. And then it continued by more letter writing. Then those who have copies, there are a few copies left in circulation, of the original letters. Compare those with the letters as they are today in the book, The Letters, and you will see that they have had quite a transformation. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you the truth, they have had 6 or 7 revisions. They are no more, that book, The Letters, is no more like the original letters that were sent out than our little baby walking is like our present walking. Oh, no, no. When I sent those letters out, originally, they represented my highest concept of understanding, of truth. But as I continued writing, I could look back and see where I'd made mistakes, where I was off, and they were rewritten. And that is why, for years and years, patients would write to me, "Why don't you publish these letters?" No, very honestly, it was 19 years after they were begun before they were published. And oh, how happy I am that I was prevented in 1941 from publishing them. When I look at them now and see how different they are in 1950 from what they were even in 1941. Our understanding is never at the standpoint of absolute wisdom. None of us. We may make statements of absolute truth, but none of us have attained the consciousness of absolute understanding, and it's for this reason that even when we make these absolute statements, that we do not understand them in the absolute. We understand them relatively, like saying God is power, and then expecting power, that God, to be some kind of a power to something for us, as if that power were at our command, as if that power were available to us to use. Do you see one of the mistakes we make? Thinking that God is a power available for us to use. The idea itself is horrible, but think how many years of saying God is power and of believing that God is power until we come to the realization, oh yes, but God isn't that kind of a power. God is the power maintaining its universe, but God is not the kind of a power that we can use. God is not the kind of power. And so, if you just write enough, if you just write out your thoughts enough, you clarify them. Writing out thoughts and clarifying them makes for a greater degree of understanding than even sitting in contemplation with them. I will agree that there may be certain men with such powers of mind that they can just take an idea into their mind and sit and ponder it, cogitate, think about it, and finally come to its ultimate wisdom. But there are not many such. To most of us, it would be far greater wisdom to take our statement of truth, to take our whatever it may be that we have in mind, and to sit down and write it out and let it unfold from within our own being, agreeing that the little truth that I have will be added to in proportion to my understanding of it, my use of it, my working with it, my pondering it. Now, this same idea is true in a meditation or in a treatment. There isn't anybody in this room that isn't capable of any treatment that ever could be demanded of them. It wouldn't make any difference what the claim may be. You can sit down and take the first truth that comes to your thought. Instead of acknowledging a lack, instead of acknowledging a lack of experience or a lack of understanding or a lack of knowledge, acknowledge that which you have. And everyone has a statement of truth. Everyone has a perception of some truth. Everyone can begin with a truth. And whether they sit down and inwardly cogitate, ponder, or whether they sit down and write for purposes of clarity, sooner or later they will be led to another statement of truth, or a greater unfoldment of the truth that they originally had, and this would expand and expand and expand until before they were through, they would find that they were at that climax, that point of click, that point of, oh, now I see it. And that would be the treatment for that particular case. You might be just as ignorant when the second one came along and have to do the same thing over and over and over again. Now, none of us knows enough about truth to sit down and write a book about truth. Nobody knows that much. There isn't anybody in all the world, even if you accept Mrs. Eddy as the greatest of her age and this age, you must know that she wrote her books bit by bit, and she changed them, and she altered them, and she edited them, and none of them were written as books. They were written as entries that later became books. And so it is with us today. I know no one capable of sitting down and writing a book on truth. There is an idea of truth that will come, like ours last night, of God is not power, and then when it has unfolded and unfolded, and you look at it, you say, there is the subject of a book. But I can assure you of this, that as that subject of last night continues to flow in me, that by the time I get through next spring's work, a book will come out of it much better than the one that was written last night. Because last night was the first of that, and it was the beginning of the idea working in my consciousness. It wasn't anything that I know. It isn't anything that I can write a book about. It is something that's flowing through me as an idea, and as it continues to flow, as I continue to speak of it, as I continue to write it, all of a sudden it will be so clear that I'll say, oh, if I could only go back to New York and do that all over again. That's happened over and over and over again with these subjects that have come up. They come up first as the seed of an idea. They come up sometimes as an idea in talking to someone in the office, in an oral treatment, or in a class, or in helping someone individually. And then all of a sudden it begins to expand and expand until it becomes full-blown. And so it is with a treatment. So it is with healing work. There is no amount of truth that you know that will do the healing work. But if you take the one truth you do know and sit with it, don't treat your patient. Just sit there and let this truth expand and expound itself within you. It will lead you to a state of consciousness in which you will say, oh, that's it. And that state of consciousness does the healing work. All the rest of the treatment, all of the words and thoughts and ideas were merely to lead you up to the state of consciousness which we call realization or apprehension or discernment. Then you do not know a truth, you actually discern its inner or esoteric meaning. The letter killeth, you know, if you depend on the letter alone. But the letter is a wonderful thing if you use it toward the evolving of the state of consciousness that we call the click, the realization. Now, inasmuch as it is an utter impossibility to blossom out as a good practitioner all at once, and I go further and say it's just as impossible ever to become a good practitioner. All that we can ever do is be the best kind of a practitioner we can be on the particular case on which we're working. Let us just be a good practitioner, a faithful one, a reliable one, on that case. That's all we can ever do. Nobody in the world is ever just going to be blanket a good practitioner? There is no such thing. There is no such thing as being, in round terms, a good practitioner. You can only be good on the particular case in which you're working. You can only be faithful to that case. Then consciousness evolves so that you can take up each case as it comes along. Many people have asked the question, if after all these years of practice you can't sit down and give one blanket treatment to all of your patients. No, you cannot, nor can you give one treatment to two patients. Every treatment must be an individual treatment. I would not care if you had 100 patients a day, and you can have them, and you can take care of them, and you can have beautiful healing results with them. But each one of them must be an individual patient, an individual treatment given at an individual moment. Then some say, but how could you have time for 100 treatments in a day? It all depends on what you call treatments. A treatment does not necessarily have to occupy time. A treatment does not necessarily have to take a minute or 30 minutes. Some do, and some a great deal more than that. But as the years go on, you find that time becomes less and less an element of treatment. Then what constitutes treatment? And how is treatment individually given? Well, at the very moment of your reaching out to a practitioner or a patient reaching out to you, that's when the first treatment takes place. The very moment a patient says, I'm going to telephone my practitioner, that's when the first treatment has been given, because the practitioner is already living in the consciousness of oneness with God. The practitioner is already in the state of consciousness that realizes my human knowledge or wisdom isn't going to help anybody, but the state of my spiritual consciousness is the Christ or healer. So that the first, let us say, contact between practitioner and patient takes place when the patient says, I'm going to telephone or write my practitioner. The second one takes place when the practitioner becomes aware of the call, and that may come in many ways. The practitioner may be sitting in their home, they may be at meal, they may be walking, when all of a sudden something will touch them, and they say, recognize, yes, someone's reaching out for help. And in that very second, they will realize God being, God identity, and the person will be healed. In that connection, again, it seems strange. My teacher must be somewhere close by today, because he keeps coming to me as an example. He tells us the story of walking along the street one day when all of a sudden the sense of death came to him. Now, he didn't know where it came from. All he knew was that he didn't feel like dying, and he had no sense of illness that would threaten his health. And so the thought came, somebody must be reaching out, somebody in danger. And so he stood still on the street and began to handle the thought of death. How would you handle the thought of death? By realizing life as infinite and omnipresent, and death as having no law or being, so forth. You would know how to handle that, until he arrived at the point where there was no longer a sense of death in his thought. And he went on about his business. And some days later, a patient came into him, man, and said, I had a strange experience this week. What is it? Well, my business has failed, and I think I'm a little bit too old to start all over again. So I thought the best thing for me to do would be suicide. So I took the train to Chicago, went to a hotel room, wrote out notes of instructions to everybody, and then I took out my revolver and lifted it to my forehead, and it fell out of my hand. He said, I didn't think it fell out. It seemed like it was pushed out. I thought, that must be a sign. And so my teacher said, when did that happen? And you can imagine, it happened at that very moment when this thought of death came to him. Now, all of us who practice have periods of what we call being downhearted, blue, under the weather, doubtful, fearful, wondering even if we do know this principle. Everyone has. I never met anyone who hasn't in this work. But remember this, that is the sign that this error, discord, inharmony, patient or patience, is reaching out to you, and you are feeling that within you and personalizing it and saying, oh, I am this. Now you see, this teacher had the wisdom to say, well, I'm not in desire of dying or even in fear of it, so this can't mean anything to do with me. So it becomes necessary for us, when these discords hit us, to say, wait a minute, that's no part of my being. I'm a practitioner. I'm going long past the stage of being downhearted about anything that could happen in the outside world. Certainly nothing that could affect this world or anyone in this world could have any effect upon me. Therefore, this is an impersonal error reaching my thought. And so you'd begin to handle that until you were perfectly clear, and then you'd say, I wonder who in my practice had that healing. And sometimes how many had that healing at that same moment. That would be a second way in which the contact between patient and practitioner would be made. Then the next way, of course, would be when you receive a telephone call or a letter. At the second of that telephone call, the contact is made between patient and practitioner, and that's when your treatment is given. Now, your treatment may involve stating some truth, or your treatment may only be, it's all right, now you forget it and leave it with me. I will take care of it. You know who me is, and you know who I am. So you know what you're talking about when you let them drop it. You know, since there's no two powers, that there's not something to be done to a sick power. Now, that may be all the treatment that's necessary. And so you're already ready by the time you've hung up the receiver for the next telephone call. In the same way, you may receive a letter. And the mere fact that it's from John Jones, you know that's one of your patients, and long before you've gotten that envelope open, the treatment has been given. So after you open the envelope and read it, it's of very little importance what's in it. The treatment was given the moment that you saw that letter and recognized who it was from. Or, may not be so, you may open it, read it, but that's a point of contact. And so it is at that moment that the treatment is given. I may sit here and a boy come in with a special delivery letter, and while I'm talking to you, I open it and read it, and I keep right on talking, but also at the same time treating. In what manner treating? Well, there's some truth about that thing that is bound to come that I am going to catch, and we're going to come to that in a minute. And that would be a point of contact. And so you see, every treatment must be an individual. And you don't give the same treatment for a cancer that you do for unemployment. Yet sometimes the same truth may come to your awareness. But usually if someone says they're unemployed, your thought will turn to the fact of God as the only being and containing within itself all activity, all substance, and so forth. But the next call has come from someone who's complaining of cancer or consumption, and your thought will come to the fact maybe of substance, of body, of being, of law, of cause. As a rule, every treatment will be not only individual, but different than the treatment that you gave before. And yet sometimes it may consist only of a sentence, and sometimes not of that. Just a smile or a flick of your finger. As much say, I don't even take that in. There too I can give you an experience of Mrs. Eddy, who once called her Boston practitioners up to Pleasant View and said, you are not doing good healing work down there. And they looked at each other to see who had squealed. Said, no, nobody told me. Nobody has to tell me. I know. And I also know why you're not doing good healing work. You are first taking in the error and trying to get rid of it, while Mother doesn't take it in to begin with. Now, you see how simple a treatment can be if you are in an exalted state of consciousness where you don't take in the error at all, where you don't give it reality, where you don't give it law, cause, body, or being. And so you come to a place where, after a while, you get so many treatments that they narrow down and down and down from 20-minute treatments to 10-minute ones and 5-minute ones, and ultimately to where many of them don't even take time, even from the standpoint of seconds. Yet, if you don't get the right response, you might have to go back and sit up a whole night to bring out a healing. Because, remember, that which brings out the healing isn't what you don't do or what you do. It is a point of realization that you attain in consciousness. And until you come to that realization or point of click, whether your treatment takes 1 minute or whether it takes 6 hours, that is what constitutes being a faithful practitioner.